The sun was sliding low behind the western hills, spilling gold over the endless stretch of dry fields and wooden fences. The air smelled of dust and summer hay. A young girl sat on the fence, swinging her bare feet, watching the ranch hands drive the cattle toward the pen. One of them, taller than the rest, rode with an easy grace that came from years of working the land. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his eyes, but when he saw her watching, he grinned. It was a smile full of mischief, and something softer too. He reined in his horse near her and leaned forward just enough to meet her gaze. "When I grow up, I'm going to marry you," she said with a stubborn little lift of her chin. The rancher threw back his head and laughed, a deep, warm sound that rolled across the fields like a promise no one took too seriously. That was more than 10 years ago. Back then, he was 17, just a lanky boy helping his father mend fences and break horses. She was a child who followed him everywhere, a shadow in a straw hat too big for her head. He'd tease her, sometimes toss her up onto his horse and let her hold the reins for a while. She'd laugh and swear she was going to marry him someday, and he'd laugh too, never imagining that words said beneath a sunset could take root and grow into something real. But that's the thing about promises made under open skies. They have a way of sticking around, waiting for the right moment to come back to life. The town of Redwood Creek was small enough that everyone knew everyone's story. Folks talked about who was marrying, who was moving, and who was struggling to keep their land. The rancher's family owned one of the biggest spreads for miles, but hard years and bad weather had turned good fortune into quiet worry. His father used to say that a man's worth was measured not by what he owned, but by what he could build back after losing everything. So when the boy left town at 19, nobody blamed him. They said he went looking for better work, maybe even adventure. Some said he'd never come back, but the girl never believed that. She grew up in a small house on the edge of town, near the dusty road that led to the ranch. Every day she'd look toward the horizon, half expecting to see that tall figure riding home. The seasons changed, people moved on, and still she waited. Her mother said she was foolish, that men like him never looked back. But something inside her held fast. She worked hard helping her father with the horses, running errands to the general store, doing whatever she could to keep her mind from wandering too far. Yet every night when the wind rustled through the trees, she'd remember that laugh, that dusty afternoon, and the way his eyes had softened just before he rode away. Years passed quietly until the summer she turned 23. The fields outside Redwood Creek were dry again, the air humming with the sound of crickets. The town hadn't changed much. The same creaky saloon, the same church bell that rang every Sunday, and the same dirt road that led straight to the ranch. Folks said the old ranch had fallen silent after his father passed away. The fences were sagging, the barn roof bent with age. People whispered that no one would come to claim it now. Then one morning, just as the sun began to rise, the sound of a truck echoed through the valley. It was old, the kind that coughed and rattled more than it ran. The townsfolk turned their heads when they saw it stop in front of the general store. A tall man stepped out, his boots worn, hat dusty, and face older than they remembered. His shoulders were broader, his jaw set firm, but there was something familiar in the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that spoke of long miles and hard lessons. He greeted the storekeeper with a nod and bought supplies without saying much. By the time word spread that he was back, half the town had already guessed why. When the girl, now a woman, heard the news, she stood frozen. For a long time she didn't move. The rancher had returned. The same man who once laughed at her promise had come back to keep one of his own. But why now? And what had brought him back after all these years? The day he rode out to the edge of town, she was there waiting. She didn't plan it that way, it just happened. Something had pulled her there, like the past was drawing her forward. He stopped a few feet away, studying her the way a man studies something he's not sure he deserves. The silence between them stretched thin, full of words neither dared to speak. Finally, he said her name, quiet and steady, as if testing how it still felt on his tongue. "You came back," she said. Her voice trembled slightly. He nodded, glancing toward the horizon where the ranch lay hidden behind the hills. "Told you I would." The words hung there, simple but heavy. There was no laughter this time, no teasing. Just the truth, plain and raw. The town buzzed for days after that. People couldn't stop talking about how he had returned to claim the ranch, maybe even the girl who'd never stopped waiting. Some said he'd struck oil out west, others whispered he'd been in trouble. Nobody knew for sure. What they did know was that the rancher had come home, and with him came stories buried under years of dust. At the ranch, things were quiet. He spent his days repairing fences, clearing the barn, and watching the sunset from the porch where his father used to sit. It was strange being back. The land felt both familiar and foreign. Every creak of the old wood brought back memories. He could almost hear his father's voice, telling him to keep his head high, to never forget where he came from. But there was more to his return than land and legacy. Something deeper had called him back, something that had been waiting for him since that summer day long ago. She visited one evening, bringing a basket of food like her mother used to. They sat on the porch, the sky turning violet as night crept in. Neither said much, but the silence between them wasn't empty. It carried the weight of years, the things they'd lost, the dreams they'd once shared, the words they'd left unsaid. He told her a little about where he'd been, the towns he'd passed through, the work he'd done, the roads that seemed to go nowhere. She listened quietly, her eyes reflecting the fading light. Then she asked him the question everyone else had been too afraid to ask. "Why did you really come back?" He looked down, turning the brim of his hat in his hands. The crickets sang in the distance, and for a moment, it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. "Because," he said slowly, "I remembered what I promised." Her breath caught. "That was a long time ago. Some promises don't have an expiration," he said, his eyes meeting hers. Something in the air shifted then. The breeze carried the scent of rain, and the first drops began to fall, soft and cool against the dust. She stood, clutching her shawl around her shoulders, unsure of what to say next. He rose too, stepping closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You said you'd marry me someday." I laughed then, but maybe I shouldn't have. The sound of thunder rolled far off in the distance. Before she could answer, lightning split the sky, bright and sudden, casting their faces in silver light. He turned toward the storm, his expression unreadable, as if something in it called to him. She wanted to reach out, to ask what he meant, but the moment broke like a wave against the wind. He walked down the steps, pausing only once to glance back at her. "I've got something to take care of before I can explain," he said. "Promise me you'll wait one more night." And before she could ask where he was going, he was gone, disappearing into the rain, leaving her standing on the porch with her heart pounding and the sound of thunder echoing across the valley. That night, the lights at the ranch burned long past midnight. In town, people saw the glow from miles away and wondered what was happening. Some said he was working late, fixing the barn. Others whispered he wasn't alone out there. By morning, the rain had stopped, but he hadn't returned. The road that led to the ranch was muddy and quiet, and standing at her window, she could only stare toward the hills, waiting for the man who'd promised to come back again. Something told her this time the promise would change everything. The morning after the storm, the air was heavy with the smell of wet soil and grass. The clouds had drifted east, leaving behind a pale blue sky that looked scrubbed clean. Down in town, people moved slower than usual, talking in low voices about the rancher's return. The general store buzzed with stories that grew taller with each telling. Some said he was back to sell the ranch, others said he'd found something buried out there. Maybe oil or gold. Nobody knew for sure, but one thing was certain: he had stirred something in the quiet rhythm of Redwood Creek. The woman couldn't shake the image of him walking into the rain the night before. She hadn't slept much. Every sound outside her window made her think he was back. She'd told herself not to care, that she'd waited long enough, but it was useless. The truth was, his return had opened a door she thought was closed for good. She remembered being a child, watching him mend fences and laughing when he tossed her his hat. That kind of memory doesn't fade. It lingers like sunlight on the back of your mind. By mid-morning, she decided to go to the ranch. The road was muddy, her boots sinking deep into the earth with every step. When she reached the gate, the land stretched out before her, familiar yet changed. The fences were half fixed, the barn doors wide open, and the smell of fresh wood mixed with damp hay. His truck was still there, parked beside the porch, but the house was quiet. She called his name, once, then again louder. No answer. Inside, the house looked lived in, but only just. A half-eaten meal sat on the table. Tools were spread out near the fireplace. On the mantel was a photograph of his father standing beside a young boy holding a lasso. She paused, running her fingers over the frame. Dust clung to the glass. The picture was old, edges curled from the years. It struck her then that maybe he wasn't just here to keep a promise. Maybe he was chasing ghosts. She turned when she heard footsteps behind her. It was Mr. Cooper, the old ranch hand who had worked for his father years ago. He looked surprised to see her. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said, wiping his hands on his vest. "He's gone up north pasture." Said something about checking the old well. "Since when is there a well up there?" she asked. Cooper scratched his chin. "Been there long before either of us. His father sealed it off when we found water turned bad. Animals kept dying near it. Nobody's been near that place in years." Her heart gave a small twist. Why would he go there? The old man shrugged. Said he had to see something for himself. Looked like he hadn't slept all night. "You know, that boy always did carry his father's worries heavier than most." She left soon after, her mind tangled in questions. She walked partway down the road and stopped near the line of trees that bordered the north pasture. The wind brushed through the grass, carrying the scent of cedar and rain. She could see the outline of the hills in the distance, and for a moment, she thought she saw him, a dark shape moving slowly across the ridge. He didn't come back to town that evening. When dusk settled, a few of the townsfolk started talking about going out there, but nobody did. The road was slick and rough, and most figured he just camped by the ridge for the night. Only she stayed up watching the hills, her lantern glowing faintly by the window. Something about it didn't feel right. By morning, word spread that Cooper had gone up to check the pasture but found nothing. No sign of him, no fresh tire tracks. Just the old well, boarded up and half swallowed by weeds. The boards looked newer, though, as if someone had tried to seal it again recently. That stirred more talk. Folks started whispering that maybe he'd found something out there, something his father had kept hidden. The woman tried to ignore the gossip, but it clung to her like burrs on her dress. She remembered how his father had always been a quiet man, rarely leaving the ranch. There were stories about him too, strange sounds from the hills at night, lights seen moving through the trees. Most people called it nonsense. But now, with the rancher gone missing for a day, old fears began to rise again. That evening, she returned to the ranch with a lantern and a blanket, telling herself she just wanted to wait in case he came back. The sky was streaked with red as the sun went down. The wind had picked up, rattling the loose boards on the barn. Inside, she found his jacket hanging on a nail, still damp from the storm. His notebook was open on the table, filled with sketches of the land and rough notes. One page caught her eye. It mentioned the north pasture, written in hurried scrawl, something under the well. Father knew. Her pulse quickened. She turned the page and found a faded letter tucked between the sheets. The paper was yellow, the ink smudged, but the handwriting was careful and steady. It was signed by his father. "My boy, if you ever come back to this land, stay away from the old well. Some things are better left buried. I made mistakes to protect what was ours. Don't repeat them." She folded the letter, feeling a chill creep through her. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. Somewhere outside, a horse snorted, restless. She peered through the window, half expecting to see him ride in from the dark, but the yard was empty. The night stretched on in uneasy silence. Every creak of the house made her flinch. At one point, she thought she heard footsteps on the porch, slow and heavy. She opened the door, her lantern trembling in her hand. But no one was there, just the soft hiss of the wind through the grass. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. By the time dawn broke, she was exhausted. She made coffee and sat on the porch, staring out toward the hills. The land looked peaceful again, as if the storm had washed everything clean. She almost convinced herself that the night before had been nothing but nerves. Then she saw a trail of footprints leading away from the barn, heading toward the north pasture. They were fresh. She followed them through the wet grass until the ground began to slope upward. The sun climbed higher, lighting the path in gold. Every few steps she stopped, listening, but all she heard was the buzz of insects and the distant call of a hawk. Finally, she reached the clearing. The boards over the old well had been pried loose. The dirt around it was disturbed, and a rope hung down into the darkness. Her breath caught. She called his name again, louder this time, her voice breaking. There was no answer, only the faint echo of her own words returning from below. Kneeling, she looked closer. The rope had been tied around a wooden beam, the end frayed and muddy. It looked like someone had gone down there recently. Behind her, the grass rustled. She turned sharply, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The wind was picking up again, bending the trees. She knew she should go back, tell someone, but her feet wouldn't move. Something about the stillness around that well made her feel as though the land itself was holding its breath. Then she noticed something near the edge of the clearing, a small leather pouch, half buried in the dirt. She brushed it off and opened it. Inside was a locket, tarnished with age. When she clicked it open, she froze. Inside was a faded picture of a woman holding a baby. On the back, scratched faintly into the metal, were the words, "For the one who returns." She dropped it, startled by the weight of the message. Her hands shook as she picked it up again. She had seen that baby before. It was him, the rancher. She was sure of it, which meant the woman in the picture wasn't his mother. The wind howled suddenly, slamming a loose board against the well's frame. The sound made her stumble back. Something deep inside whispered that she shouldn't be there, that whatever was buried beneath that ground wasn't meant to be found. Still, she couldn't walk away. As she turned toward the path, she heard a faint noise, like a low groan echoing from the well. She froze. It came again, soft but real, rising through the still air. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She leaned closer, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" The sound stopped. Then a rope shifted, the wood creaked, and something tugged hard from below, almost pulling the beam off its stand. She stumbled back, nearly dropping her lantern. The rope went still again, swaying gently. She backed away, eyes fixed on the dark hole in the ground. There was no movement now, only silence. But deep down, she knew she hadn't imagined it. Someone or something was down there. She turned and ran all the way back to the house, breathless, clutching the locket in her hand. She didn't stop until she reached the porch. Inside, the letter still lay open on the table, the words warning her again, "Some things are better left buried." She sank into a chair, staring at the door, waiting for him to return. But as the light faded and the crickets began to sing, the truth sank in whatever he'd gone looking for. It had found him first. The days that followed moved slow, each one stretching longer than the last. The woman tried to convince herself that he'd gone into town or maybe headed to a nearby ranch for supplies. But deep down, she knew better. The ranch had a strange stillness about it now, the kind that seeps into the walls and lingers in the air. The old letter still lay on the table, and every time she read the words, her heart tightened. His father's warning wasn't just about superstition, it felt like a confession, something heavy with regret. By the third day, worry had turned into fear. The townsfolk had started to notice his absence to Dotmer. Cooper rode into town to tell the sheriff, though everyone already seemed to know. Redwood Creek was the kind of place where news traveled faster than the wind. They organized a small search party, just a few men with lanterns and rifles, heading toward the north pasture at dusk. She wanted to go with them, but Cooper stopped her. "You've done enough worrying, miss," he said gently. "Let us handle this. If he's out there, we'll bring him home." She stood by the gate as they rode away, the sound of horses fading into the hills. The night came down fast, the stars hidden behind a sheet of dark clouds. She waited, heart pounding, until their lanterns were just faint dots in the distance. The wind carried faint voices and the crackle of dry grass, but nothing more. Hours passed before she saw them returning, moving slower than they had left. They hadn't found him. All they saw, Cooper said, was the well, its boards torn loose again, as if something inside had been trying to get out. No tracks, no sign of struggle, no footprints that led away. Only the wind and the sound of water echoing far below. The sheriff said it was too dangerous to go down without the right equipment. He promised they'd come back with ropes and tools in the morning. But the next morning came, and no one returned. Folks had work to do, and some said the land up there was cursed anyway. By nightfall, no one wanted to talk about the rancher anymore. She couldn't let it go. That evening, she went back to the house again. The rooms felt colder now, though the fire still burned in the hearth. She looked around, noticing small details she hadn't before: the boots by the door, still caked with dried mud, and a map pinned on the wall with markings all around the north pasture. Each mark looked like a boundary, but one spot near the well was circled twice. Next to it, written faintly, were the words "deeper than it looks." Her chest tightened as she stared at it. Deeper than it looks. She didn't sleep that night. The thought of him trapped down there wouldn't leave her. At dawn, she packed a small bag, took a lantern, and headed toward the hills alone. The ground was damp with dew, and a soft mist clung to the fields. When she reached the clearing, the air felt different, thicker somehow, like the world was holding a secret. The boards over the well had been moved again, some broken in half. The rope she'd seen before was gone, replaced by a new one tied hastily to the beam. She knelt near the edge, calling his name. Only silence answered. She thought she heard something faint, maybe water dripping, maybe not. Her pulse raced as she leaned closer, holding the lantern over the dark opening. The light didn't reach the bottom. It was too deep, too still. Behind her, something shifted in the trees. She froze, turning sharply, but saw no one. Still, she could feel it, a presence, faint but real. The hairs on her neck stood on end. The ranch had never felt like this before. Even when it was quiet, it had life. Now it felt drained, like the earth itself was uneasy. Then she saw movement, just a flicker between the trees, a dark figure standing still, watching her. She lifted the lantern higher, her voice trembling. "Who's there?" The figure didn't answer. When she stepped toward it, it turned and vanished behind the ridge. She followed. The path wound upward, narrow and steep, until she reached a small clearing overlooking the valley. There, half hidden under a fallen tree, she found a small wooden crate. It looked old, the wood gray with rot. On its lid were initials burned into the surface, HT, his father's. She crouched, pried it open carefully. Inside were papers, a few rusted tools, and a metal box sealed shut with wire. She tugged the wire loose, and when she opened it, a small journal fell into her lap. The first page was written in his father's steady hand. "Spring, 1894. Found something beneath the well today. It wasn't water. Men refused to go near it after dark. I sealed it for good. If anyone ever opens it again, may God forgive them." She read on, her hands trembling. The entries grew darker, describing nights filled with strange sounds, whispers rising from the ground, shadows that moved without wind. He wrote about losing livestock, about men quitting after seeing things they couldn't explain. One page mentioned a fire in the barn, blamed on lightning, but the words beneath it hinted otherwise. "The light came from below," it said. "I saw it with my own eyes." Her stomach turned cold. The last entry was short. "If my son returns, tell him not to dig. The land remembers." She closed the journal, her breath shaking. If what his father wrote was true, then the well wasn't just an old hole in the ground, it was something worse. Something alive in its own way. She thought of the rancher's notebook, the words father knew. Maybe he'd found the same box before her. Maybe that's why he'd gone down there. The thought made her chest ache. When she returned to the house, the sun was already sinking behind the hills. The air was thick and heavy, a storm building again on the horizon. She sat at the kitchen table, the journal open before her, and tried to make sense of it all. Could he still be alive down there? And if he was, what was keeping him from coming back? That night, she dreamt of the well. She saw water shimmering deep below, and his voice calling faintly from the darkness. He was asking her to help him. But when she leaned closer, the water turned black. She woke up drenched in sweat, the echo of his voice still in her ears. The next morning, Mr. Cooper showed up at her door. His face was pale, his head in his hands. "You been out there again, haven't you?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer. He sighed. "I worked that land for 30 years. I know things about it folks wouldn't believe." His father wasn't a bad man, but he was scared of something. "Whatever's in that ground, it ain't natural." She told him about the box, about the journal, about what she'd read. Cooper listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked toward the hills, his eyes tired. "There's something else you ought to know," he said. "Your father and his were partners once. They found that well together." Her breath caught. "My father? That can't be." He nodded. "They swore never to speak of it again. Your father left the ranch soon after. Said the land wasn't meant to be worked. Said it was cursed. But I reckon he knew the truth better than most." Her heart felt heavy. All these years, her family and his had been tied to that same secret. Maybe that's why the rancher had come back to uncover what both their fathers had hidden. As the day went on, the wind grew stronger, bending the trees and rattling the windows. She couldn't shake the feeling that something beneath the earth was stirring again. The animals in the fields were restless, and the air carried that strange metallic scent that always came before a storm. She lit a lantern, knowing she wouldn't sleep. Just past midnight, she heard it. A knock at the door. It was slow, deliberate. 3 times. She froze, listening. The knock came again. She rose carefully, the lantern trembling in her hand, and opened the door. No one was there. The yard was empty, the fields silent. Then, as she turned to close it, she saw muddy footprints on the porch fresh, ones leading away toward the barn. Her pulse raced. She followed them, each step crunching softly on the gravel. The barn doors were half open, the light from her lantern casting long shadows inside. The smell of wet earth filled the air. And then she saw his hat, lying near the ladder that led to the loft. She bent to pick it up, her fingers brushing the worn brim. That's when she heard a whisper, faint, close, and familiar. Her heart leapt. She turned sharply, scanning the dark corners, but there was no one there. The sound came again, this time from beneath the floorboards. A low, strained voice calling her name. She dropped the lantern, its light spinning across the walls. The boards beneath her feet trembled slightly, like something was moving under the ground. She stumbled back, clutching the hat to her chest. The voice had stopped, but she could still feel it, deep in her bones, a pull toward the well, toward the truth buried below the ranch. Whatever was down there hadn't let him go. And now, it was calling her too. She stood frozen as thunder cracked across the sky, the wind tearing through the open doors. The lantern flame flickered and died, leaving her in darkness, in that silence. One thought filled her mind: if she wanted to bring him back, she'd have to go down there herself. But as lightning flashed outside, she saw something at the far end of the barn, a figure standing still, watching her, tall, familiar. And though she couldn't see his face, she knew that if she called his name, something would answer. But she wasn't sure anymore if it would be him. The storm broke across the valley that night, wild and unforgiving. The wind howled through the hills, rattling the windows of the ranch house, and the rain came down in heavy sheets that blurred the line between sky and earth. The woman stood at the window, watching lightning tear across the horizon, her heart pounding. Every flash lit up the fields, the barn, and the narrow trail that led toward the old well. She couldn't shake the image of that figure she'd seen standing in the barn, the shape that looked like him, but didn't move like him. She'd spent hours convincing herself it was only her mind playing tricks, but something deep inside whispered that it wasn't. She sat by the fire, clutching his hat, turning it over in her hands. The fabric still held the faint scent of smoke and leather, the kind of smell that reminded her of the long summers when he used to ride home after dusk. She wanted to believe he was alive, that he'd come walking through the door any second, drenched from the storm, but smiling like he used to. But the silence of the house told her otherwise. The walls creaked softly, like the place was remembering things it shouldn't. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air thick and heavy. Mist curled over the fields, and the sky hung low with pale light. She hadn't slept at all. When she stepped outside, her boots sank into the wet earth. The ground felt strange beneath her feet, soft in places where it shouldn't be. As she walked toward the barn, she saw that the footprints from the night before were gone, washed clean by the rain. Only the open doors remained, swaying slightly in the wind. Inside, the smell of damp hay filled her lungs. The boards where she'd heard the voice were wet and swollen. She knelt, pressing her ear close to the wood, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, she heard it, a sound, low and distant, like the echo of someone breathing far below. Her throat went dry. She whispered his name. The sound stopped. Her lantern flickered. She stood quickly, her pulse racing, and backed toward the door. The light dimmed, then flared again, casting long shadows along the beams of the barn. One shadow moved against the others, slow and deliberate. She froze, her breath catching. Then she saw it, a shape at the far end, taller than before, stepping out from behind the stalls. The figure stopped just within the circle of her light. It was him, or at least, it looked like him. His hat was gone, his clothes torn, his face half hidden by dirt and shadow. But his eyes, those eyes were what froze her in place. They didn't look like they used to. They were darker now, distant, as if he'd seen something he couldn't leave behind. She took a hesitant step forward. "You're alive," she whispered. He didn't answer, just stood there, the rain dripping from his hair, staring at her. "You were gone for days," she said, her voice trembling. "Where were you?" He finally spoke, but his voice was rough, almost unfamiliar. "Down there." Her stomach twisted. "In the well." He nodded slowly, his gaze shifting toward the door, as if expecting something or someone to follow him. "I found what my father was hiding." The silence that followed was heavy. She wanted to ask what he meant, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't just fear she saw there, it was guilt. He turned away, running a hand through his hair. "He was right," he murmured. "We should have left it buried." She stepped closer. "What did you see?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked past her, out into the gray morning, and she followed, unsure whether to be relieved or afraid. His steps were slow, almost cautious, like the ground itself was dangerous. When they reached the clearing near the well, she felt her stomach drop. The boards were gone again, torn away completely this time. The rope hung loose, slick with mud. The air above the opening shimmered faintly, like heat rising off desert sand, though the air was cold. He stopped a few feet away, staring down into the hole. "It's not just a well," he said quietly. "It's something else." The wind shifted, carrying with it a deep, low hum so faint she thought she might be imagining it. But when she looked at him, she saw it in his face. He heard it too. "I went down," he continued, his voice shaking slightly. "The air down there, it felt alive. I found water, but it wasn't water. It moved on its own, like it was breathing. I saw my father's name carved into the stone, and others too, names I didn't know. It was like the earth was keeping them there." She took a step back. "You have to stop," she said. "We need to go. Tell the sheriff." He shook his head. No one would believe it. He turned to her then, his face pale, eyes wild. "It's not finished. It's awake now." Her pulse pounded in her ears. "What's awake?" He didn't answer. The ground near the well shuddered slightly, a faint vibration that made the rope sway. She grabbed his arm. "We have to leave," she said, pulling him back, but he didn't move. His eyes were locked on the hole, his body tense. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air. The rope snapped, whipping up into the wind. The ground trembled harder, and the hum grew louder, pulsing like a heartbeat. She stumbled back, her hand slipping. From his, the light from her lantern flickered wildly, and in its glow, she saw movement inside. The well, something shifting, rising through the darkness. "Don't look at it," he shouted, grabbing her wrist and pulling her away. They ran toward the house, mud splashing under their boots. Behind them, the sound grew a low, deep rumble that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. The air felt heavy, pressing down on them with each step. Inside, he bolted the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. She stood trembling by the window, staring toward the pasture. The light outside dimmed even though the sky was clear. It was as if something had drawn the day out of the land. "What did you bring back?" she whispered. He looked up, his face pale and drawn. "I don't know," he said, "but it followed me." For hours, they sat in silence listening. Every few minutes, there'd be a faint sound from outside, a rustle of grass, a scrape against the wood, the whisper of footsteps circling the house. Once, she thought she saw a shadow move across the window, but when she looked again, it was gone. As night fell, the air grew colder. The fire sputtered and died, even though there was still wood on the grate. He stood, pacing the floor, glancing toward the door like he expected it to open on its own. She tried to speak, but her voice barely worked. "We can go to town at sunrise," she said. "We'll tell Cooper, the sheriff, someone will help." He didn't answer. He just stared at the door. Then he said, almost to himself, "It doesn't want me to leave." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He turned slowly to face her. "When I was down there, I heard voices. They sounded like people I knew, my father, the men who worked the ranch. They told me to stay, said the land would take care of me. I think I believed them." She shook her head. "You're tired. You need to rest." But he only smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's not tiredness. It's calling." The floor creaked beneath them, deep and slow, like something shifting beneath the foundation. She froze, glancing down. Dust drifted from the ceiling. He stepped closer to her, his hand brushing hers. "If it tries to take me again," he said softly. "Don't follow. Don't say that," she whispered. The sound came again, a groan from deep within the ground, followed by a faint whisper that seemed to come from every wall of the house. It wasn't words this time, just a sound like breathing. The lamps flickered, the glass rattled, and outside, the wind began to rise again. He moved to the window, his face tense. "It's spreading," he said. "Look." She joined him, her heart sinking. Across the fields, patches of ground seemed to sink slightly, as if the earth itself was deflating. The cattle in the distance were running, their cries sharp against the wind. A strange light glowed faintly from the direction of the well, pale and unsteady. She grabbed his arm. "We need to go now." He didn't move. "If we leave, it'll follow. This land, it's tied to us, to our families. I think that's why it woke up when I came back." She stared at him, unable to find the words. "Then what are we supposed to do?" Before he could answer, a sharp crack split the air. The window pane shattered inward, glass scattering across the floor. The wind rushed through the room, snuffing out the last of the light. She screamed, clutching his arm, and for a moment, she swore she saw a shadow in the doorway, tall, human, but moving wrong. He pulled her behind him, grabbing the lantern. "Get back," he shouted. The door shook violently, hinges groaning, and the boards along the walls began to creak. Outside, the humming had turned into a deep, rhythmic pulse that made the whole house vibrate. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence filled the air, thick, heavy, unnatural. He lowered the lantern slowly. The flame flickered weakly, throwing small circles of light across the room. "Stay here," he said, stepping toward the door. She caught his hand. "Don't," she whispered, but he didn't listen. He unlatched the lock and pulled the door open. The wind had died completely. The fields were still. In the distance, the glow from the well pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat waiting to rise again. He took one step outside. The earth beneath his boots gave a low groan. She watched from the doorway, frozen between fear and the desperate hope that maybe this was finally over. But when he turned back toward her, his face pale under the dim light, the ground split open behind him, swallowing the sound of the wind, and she knew the night had only just begun. The ground opened behind him with a sound like thunder muffled under soil. For one terrifying moment, he teetered at the edge, his boots sliding on the wet ground. She screamed his name and rushed forward, her hands gripping his arm just as the earth gave way. They both fell backward onto the porch, the light from the lantern swinging wildly above them. The ground where he had stood moments before collapsed completely, leaving a dark, gaping hole that seemed to breathe out a cold wind. She held onto him tightly, both of them shaking. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the quiet settling of the soil and the faint, rhythmic pulse that had haunted them for days now fading into the distance. He lay there, his chest rising and falling fast, eyes wide as if still seeing what lay beneath. She touched his face gently, whispering his name again, and after a moment, he turned his head toward her. His voice was barely a breath. "It's gone." She wanted to believe that, wanted to cling to it like sunlight after a storm, but the air around them still felt heavy, as if the land hadn't quite decided whether to rest or rise again. The faint glow from the direction of the well flickered once more, then dimmed completely. The silence that followed was the kind that made you listen for things that weren't there. She helped him sit up. His shirt was torn, his skin cold to the touch. "You're hurt," she said. He shook his head. "Not like before. I think it's done now. Whatever it was, it wanted to be seen. And now it's gone." She glanced at the hole again. The edges were jagged, the mud already sinking inward, slowly filling itself. It looked like the land was closing its own wound. She felt an ache deep in her chest. Not just fear, but something sadder, heavier. The kind of feeling that came from knowing you'd been close to something vast and strange and might never understand it completely. They sat there on the porch until the first light of dawn began to stretch across the hills. The birds didn't sing that morning. The air was still, the fields damp with fog. When she finally stood, she saw how much the storm had changed everything. The fences were down, the barn roof partly torn, and the well, what was left of it, was little more than a hollow mound now. the boards and stones buried under layers of wet earth. He stood beside her, shoulders slumped but eyes clearer than they had been in days. "My father knew," he said quietly. "He must have seen it too. That's why he warned me never to dig near the well. He wasn't hiding something bad. He was protecting us." She looked at him, the truth of it slowly sinking in. "And you think it's over?" He didn't answer right away. "I think it's resting," he said finally, like the land finally got what it wanted. The following days passed in a strange kind of calm. The sky stayed clear, and for the first time in weeks, the air smelled clean. He spent his days fixing what he could around the ranch, patching fences and mending tools, trying to bring normal back. She helped him, though sometimes when he paused, she could tell his mind wasn't fully here. He'd stare off toward the field, to the place where the well had been, as if waiting for a sound that didn't come. At night, they kept the lanterns burning low, just enough to push away the dark. Neither of them liked silence anymore. Sometimes she caught him whispering under his breath, not words she could make out, just soft sounds, like he was speaking to the land itself. When she asked him about it, he said, "It helps me sleep." On the fourth morning, they rode into town. The sheriff, Cooper, met them outside the general store. He was an older man with sharp eyes that had seen too many strange things, but rarely believed any of them. When they told him about the sinkhole and the strange noises, he frowned but didn't interrupt. When they finished, he scratched his chin and said, "Old wells collapse all the time. Probably a pocket of gas underground. Nothing more." She almost wanted to correct him, to tell him it wasn't just the earth but something else alive down there. But she didn't. The way he said it, simple, reasonable, sounded safer. So she just nodded. Cooper looked at the man beside her and said, "You're lucky it didn't take you down with it. The land around here's been shifting for years. Some things just don't stay buried." Those words lingered in her mind long after they rode back home. By the end of the week, the hole where the well had been was filled with rainwater. The ground had settled smooth, like nothing unusual had ever happened. Grass had already begun to grow at the edges, green and soft. Sometimes, in the evenings, the man would walk out there and stand quietly, watching the light fade across the fields. He never spoke of what he'd seen down there again, but she could tell the memory lived behind his eyes. It wasn't fear anymore, though it was understanding. One night, as they sat by the fire, she asked him, "What if it comes back?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Then we'll listen this time," he said. "We'll treat it like part of the land, not something to fight." She nodded, though a small part of her hoped she'd never have to test that promise. The fire crackled softly between them, the shadows long and warm now instead of cold. The days grew longer, and soon summer began to settle over the valley. The earth felt different, quieter, but alive in a gentler way. When rain came again, it wasn't heavy or angry, just a soft, steady drizzle that soaked the soil and made everything bloom. Sometimes, she'd still wake in the night and think she heard a faint hum beneath the ground. But it never lasted more than a moment. It was like the land was breathing in its sleep, dreaming. She'd lay back down and close her eyes, and the sound would fade into the wind. Months later, when they finally decided to leave the ranch for good, she walked to the field one last time. The grass had grown thick and tall, and the place where the well once stood was covered in wildflowers. She knelt there, touching the petals lightly, and whispered a quiet thank you to the land, to the silence, to whatever had allowed them to stay. He came up behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Ready?" he asked. She looked up at him and smiled faintly. "Yeah, I think the land's had enough of us." He smiled too, that tired but peaceful look he'd learned to wear. As they walked back toward the house, the sun dipped low, casting long golden light across the valley. The air was still, the kind of stillness that didn't feel empty, but full, like everything was exactly where it was meant to be. When they finally drove away, she looked back one last time. The ranch stood quiet, small against the wide open hills. In the distance, a breeze moved through the tall grass, bending it in soft waves. For a moment, she thought she saw the faint shimmer of light near the old well's resting place, but then it was gone, swallowed by the glow of sunset. Life after that moved slowly, in quiet rhythms that felt ordinary again. They settled in a small town far from the valley, where the air smelled of pine instead of dust. He found work with horses, and she opened a little store near the main street. Sometimes people would ask about the old ranch, and she'd smile and say it was home for a while. The land there had a life of its own. She never told the rest. At night, when the wind was still, she sometimes thought about that last storm, the hum in the earth, and the way the land had closed itself up like it was healing. Maybe, she thought, everything in the world carried memories, some that slept quietly, waiting for someone to listen. In her heart, she knew they hadn't escaped something evil. They'd simply witnessed something ancient, a reminder that the earth wasn't just dirt beneath their feet, but something alive, something that remembered. And in that remembering, maybe it had decided to forgive. The valley remained quiet for years after. Travelers passed by, noting how green the fields looked, how peaceful the air felt. No one spoke of the well or the family that once lived nearby. But sometimes when the wind shifted just right, a faint hum could still be heard beneath the soil, a soft, steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of the land itself, alive and waiting.